to the Sales Influence Podcast, where we talk about finding the why and how people buy. I'm your host, Victor Antonio, man. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for lending me your ears. Today, I want to talk about using metaphors and analogies to really drive home a key point in a presentation, because there's nothing better than using some physical example to maybe drive home some intangible, or I'll just say soft type of concept. So let me give you an idea. Let me give you the outline first, and then have you think about how you're going to use it. 4-step process to using this in a presentation. Now, first of all, I want you to think of a concrete object. Now, I'm going to give you an example. Just kind of think of an object. Think of an object that you might use to explain something in a presentation. Step number 2, you're going to tie that object into a business situation or a business problem. Step number 3, you're going to go ahead and describe the analogy. In other words, how that product or that object rather ties into the business solution. And then step number 4, you're going to show how it applies to the actual customer. Now, sounds complicated, but it isn't. Now, so let me give you a tangible example. So step number 1 would be to think of an object, right? So my object is a dry sponge. A dry sponge. Can you visualize a sponge so dry that it's like a brick? It's really just hard, right? Got it in your head. Now, I said, okay, that's the object I'm going to use. Then I'm going to think of a business problem. I'm going to think of a business situation or a business problem that I'm currently having. And maybe one of the things that I want to communicate as a sales trainer, Victor Antonio, Sales Velocity Academy, one of the things I like to communicate to people is that you don't want to train people just one time. You should almost use like a drip training session. In other words, a little bit on 1 month or 1 week, and just really continue. It's continuous education. That's my philosophy. Maybe 1 course a month, maybe 1 course a week, whatever it may be, but not all at one time. Then the 3rd step is I'm now going to draw the analogy, right? And so now I'm going to explain this analogy, and it'll go something like this. Have you ever had a dry sponge in your hand? And have you ever just tried to pour, let's say, a glass of water, just splash a glass of water over that dry sponge? My question to you is, how much of that water will actually be absorbed by that dry sponge? Now, you can visualize that, right? You can visualize the dry sponge in my hand, a glass of water being splashed right on there, and you can also visualize the water just basically coming off the sponge. The majority of the water just spills over, and maybe 5% of the water is actually absorbed by the sponge. Then, I'm going to turn it into a business situation. See, now in business, it's almost the same thing. When we're trying to train people quickly, it's like dumping a cup of water on a dry sponge. The majority is going to go to waste. The only way to really get the sponge to absorb more water is to, instead of just dropping the whole cup on it, just splashing the whole glass on it, maybe you just drip a little bit. Wait a bit, drip a little bit. Wait a bit, drip a bit, and next thing you know, the sponge is becoming more absorbent. And that is how you should train your salespeople, not in one splash, once a year, but maybe over time, over the next 12 months. Now, you see what I did there? I made it visual. And because it's visual, you're less likely to forget it. In fact, from this moment on, every time you look at a dry sponge, you may think of this analogy. But think about when you're presenting to your customers, it's the same thing. What can you do? What object can you think about? So let's think of a business problem and maybe even find an object. Or you can find an object and then try to wrap it around the business problem. It doesn't matter which goes first. Whatever's convenient for you. Now, what I want you to do is think of that business problem and then maybe think of an object that you could use to really drive home that point. And then after you explain the analogy, the real key here is to tie it into something that really matters to the client. In my case, I tried to tie training, sales training, and the loss of information over a dry sponge. And I'm telling the customer, Mr. Customer, you can hire me once a year, but it's better that if you hire me, more frequently, or use my Sales Velocity Academy where your people can train on it every week, and little by little, their brains, also known as the sponge, will absorb more information. So give that some thought. How would you use a physical object to describe a business problem to drive home a point? Let me know what you think. Love to hear your feedback, and that is it for this Sales Influence podcast. Don't forget to leave me some feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, Spotify, Pandora. We're all over the place here. Do me a favor also, share this podcast with at least one other person. I would really, really, really appreciate that. Also, if you haven't checked out the Sales Velocity Academy, why not? If you want to learn how to sell more faster, check out salesvelocityacademy.com. Over 50 courses, 500 videos. It is probably one of the most comprehensive sales training platforms in the world. How's that? Lastly, I want to thank you for listening. This is Victor Antonio, always reminding you, selling ain't hard when you know how. Take care.
Hi, I'm Victor Antonio. I'm an author, sales trainer, and keynote speaker. I'm often asked, what makes a great speaker? Is it someone who delivers real content that the audience can use? Is it someone who engages the audience so they're part of the learning experience? Or is it someone who can motivate an audience to push them beyond their comfort zone and discover new abilities? The answer is yes. But the most important thing to remember is that I'm not there to look good. I'm there to make my client look good. Simply put, it's never about me, and it's always about them.